I wanted to start first by mentioning that this work was Ella Bohlman's senior thesis. She graduated last spring and has gone off into the world, so she wasn't able to come here and give this talk, but I really wanted to acknowledge her enormous contribution to this work and really her remarkable achievement as an undergrad. All right. So I'm going to start by saying that speaking is hard. Speaking involves taking a message and turning it into a string of words. And when doing this, speakers often have multiple choices for how to phrase a single message. So these might be choices about word choice, so do I say couch or do I say sofa? Or choices about sentence structure, do I say an active sentence or a passive sentence? And we see that speakers often make choices to make that language production process easier. So I'm going to talk about one particular kind of choice that speakers make, which I'll call do the easy thing first to save time for the harder thing. So an example of this is speakers often place more lexically accessible words or easier to plan and produce words earlier in utterances. So for example, speakers tend to place frequent words earlier in utterances, animate words, imageable words, discourse given words, primed words earlier in utterances when languages permit you to do so. We see a similar phenomenon at the phrase level, where speakers tend to put shorter and more accessible phrases earlier in utterances. An example of this might be heavy NP shift, where speakers will put shorter phrases before longer phrases when languages permit this. Another choice that speakers sometimes make is to use a short or frequent optional word. So an example of this might be a disfluency, where speakers insert something like an or an during a time of planning difficulty in order to keep the floor and maintain fluency. Similar, we see this with the use of that in English. In many sentences in English, that is optional. So we can say the coach knew you missed practice, or the coach knew that you missed practice. And speakers tend to use these optional that's before more complex phrases. And so we considered another kind of word that might serve this same purpose as a short, frequent, optional word, and that's adjectives. So why adjectives? First, they're very frequent. If I show you this frequency plot here of the words of English, we see adjectives are also represented as some of the most frequent words in English. In fact, the only words more frequent than those most frequent adjectives are pronouns, articles, prepositions, and other kinds of closed class words. Adjectives are also very short. There's on average about 1.5 syllables in the 100 most frequent adjectives. So what we see is adjectives are very short, very frequent, and for those reasons, very easy to plan and produce, so perhaps they're a good candidate for these optional words. Excuse me. Another reason adjectives might be good candidates for these optional words is that we see that speakers will often overspecify and use adjectives when they're not completely necessary. So to kind of a broad analysis of this literature is really that speakers are very likely to say the red hat instead of the hat, despite there only being one hat in the display. So that's the kind of overspecification of saying red when the task doesn't really require you to say red because there's only one hat. So the premise of this work is that we hypothesize that speakers use adjectives as optional words which they can use strategically to increase planning time. So if this is true, speakers should use optional adjectives more often when planning more difficult words. So we developed a task in which speakers can use optional color adjectives in a task with trials that vary in difficulty. And in order to vary production difficulty, we manipulated name agreement. So name agreement is the number of different candidate labels for an object, and this really affects naming difficulty. So for example, objects like chair and candle, which really have one dominant label that people tend to use to label them, or have high name agreement, and these kinds of high name agreement objects tend to be faster and more accurate to name than low name agreement items like coat, jacket, or couch, sofa that have multiple label candidates. So our predictions is that speakers should use more optional color adjectives when describing low name agreement items than high name agreement items. So for example, speakers might be more likely to say the blue jacket for that low name agreement jacket, which could have been coat, as opposed to candle, which really just has that one dominant label. And the time course of sentence production should also reflect that greater difficulty of planning those low name agreement items. So this is the task. Participants named objects that were either of high or low name agreement. They appeared in an array like this, and there was a green box around the target object in order to indicate to the participant which object to name. And so we see in some trials, participants named that high name agreement candle or the low name agreement couch sofa. And then objects also sometimes had a different shaped competitor or did not. So in some cases, there was a second object of the same shape in the display, but of a different color. And sometimes that target object was the only type of that object in the display. So this led to a 2x2 design within participants. So each participant named each item only once, and this was counterbalanced over participants. So some participants would have seen jacket coat with a same-shaped competitor, and some people would have seen that jacket coat without a same-shaped competitor, but everybody saw that target item only once. And of course, the position of the target was randomized across each trial. It's all in the same position here just for simplicity, but of course in the actual task, people saw that position anywhere. And name agreement was assessed in a separate group of participants. I'm happy to talk about how we did all that norming, but I won't talk about it here. So 36 participants who learned English before age 5 were told to describe the object in the green square in order to fully differentiate it from the other objects in the picture. Like this. There were 54 target trials, 108 filler trials, which included both same-shaped competitor and no same-shaped competitor trials. And responses were audio recorded and then transcribed. All right. So our predictions. Participants should use a uniformly high rate of adjectives when a color competitor exists. So in the left column there, we ought to see very high rates of adjective use because you really have to use an adjective in order to appropriately complete the task. But when there was no color competitor, participants should use more adjective to describe those low name agreement objects. And again, timing measures should reflect that greater difficulty of the low name agreement objects. So let's move on to some data. Across the y-axis here, I'll show you the proportion of trials with an adjective by same-shaped competitor and no same-shaped competitor, so with the ones that needed an adjective to do the tasks and the ones that didn't really need an adjective to do the task by high and low agreement. I'll put those little shapes there to aid your interpretation of the graph. And so we indeed see this uniformly high rate of adjective use when there is a competitor of the same shape. And we see a difference when there is no color competitor of that higher rate of adjective use for those low name agreement objects. So we, of course, see this when we do the mixed effect model. We see the main effect of competitor type, perfectly reasonable, makes sense. And also this competitor by agreement interaction, again, seeing that there is a uniformly high rate of adjective use with that same shape competitor, but when there was not a same shape competitor, when you didn't need to say an adjective in order to complete the task, people said adjectives more often for the low name agreement objects. So we'll now move on to some of the timing measures. And so here we coded for the start of speech, so the beginning of the speaker utterance, the start of the adjective when speakers produced an adjective, as well as the start of the noun. And so what I'm going to report here are initiation latencies, so from the appearance of the array until participants began speaking, as well as the duration of the adjective. So this is the amount of time it took participants to produce that adjective up until the onset of the noun. So again, I'll show you those results for the initiation latencies. So again, now I have initiation latency on the y-axis. I'll show you bars for a same-shaped competitor and no same-shaped competitor by high and low agreement. And again, I'll put those little images on there to aid interpretation. And so this is what we see here. First, when you put adjective use in the model, we actually don't see an effect of adjective use on initiation latencies. But we do see this main effect of name agreement here, which is really a replication of these classic effects of longer initiation latencies for the low name agreement object, so this makes a lot of sense. We also do see this main effect of competitor with longer latencies when there is not a same color competitor. It's possible this has to do with lower rates of adjectives without a color competitor, so speakers are taking longer to begin speaking when they aren't producing an adjective. So really kind of a trade-off between longer latencies and adjective use. I will say this result's a little persnickety depending on exactly how we build the models, I think particularly because of this collinearity between condition and adjective use. So I'm not terribly confident in this result. So really what I want you to take away from this slide is that we have a very clear replication of classic name agreement effects in naming times for these longer latencies for the low name agreement objects. But let's now turn to adjective length. So what I'm going to show you here, the length of time it took people to produce those adjectives. And here I'm going to show you just trials in which participants did produce adjectives. So this is the 87, 89% of same shape competitors, that very high rate of adjective use there, as well as the 49, 57% of adjectives in the no competitor case. So this is a subset of the data there. And this is what we see here. What we see is a really robust main effect of name agreement. Adjectives were longer when the following object had low name agreement. And so this is consistent with our story that adjectives are being used as optional words to give extra planning time because they're providing more planning time for the harder to plan words. So what we see here is converging evidence for adjectives as markers of egocentric production. Speakers used more adjectives when the task did not require it, when the target object had low name agreement. And speakers took longer to produce an adjective when the target object had low name agreement. So what we see is that the ease of producing a target affected both the likelihood of producing an adjective as well as how long it took to produce. And so we believe that considering producer constraints may help make sense of some patterns of adjective use that we see in the world. So in addition to providing relevant information to the listener, adjectives might serve an additional purpose of easing the burdens of sentence production for the speaker. And considering this additional purpose might be informative of some other findings that we see. So for example, the overspecification that we talked about, where speakers are very likely to call that hat a red hat despite not needing to use an adjective in order to complete the task. And I think there's several ways to interpret this result. So one is that adjectives are in fact informative and useful for the audience, and that's why speakers produce them. Perhaps we might call this an audience design explanation. Or another not mutually exclusive explanation is adjectives are salient to the listener, well then they're also salient to the speaker, and that may lead to more production of adjectives. And I think our data, we would like to include a third interpretation to this list, again, of non-mutually exclusive explanations, that at least in some cases, extra specification gives extra planning time to the speaker. Another finding that I think we might be able to shed some light on are these different rates of adjectives in pre-nominal and post-nominal languages. So this is a study by Rubio Fernandez showing rates of adjective use when describing these either monochrome or polychrome displays. And what we see is that English speakers are much more likely to produce adjectives in both the monochrome and polychrome condition relative to Spanish speakers, where Spanish, the adjective will come after the noun. And so one potential interpretation of this is that adjectives after the noun are really not useful optional words to give speakers extra planning time, leading to lower rates of adjectives in those post-nominal languages. We also point to findings that, for example, English speakers are more likely to use an adjective with lower frequency nouns like dachshund than higher frequency nouns like dog, despite lower frequency nouns conveying more information and presumably needing less adjectives in order to identify that concept. And here the authors offer an information theoretic account that the adjective provides a reduction in entropy. But this result is equally consistent with an egocentric speaker aiding account, such that adjectives can be strategically used when planning more difficult nouns like dachshund relative to dog. And we think these results speak to the importance of understanding speaker choices in order to understand where language distributions come from. So with an increase in interest in looking at language distributions to understand language behavior, or perhaps even with an increase in interest in AI, where the statistical distributions of language are directly related to how the models work, perhaps there's a renewed interest in figuring out where these statistical distributions came from in the first place. And constraints on speakers may be an important component of that story. Speakers must convey a message while maintaining fluency during the cognitive demands of sentence production. And various patterns of statistical distributions in languages don't wear on their sleeve where they came from. It can be hard to figure out where those distributions came from and how they got there. And considering the egocentric origins may be as important as other explanations for the statistical distributions in language. And that examples of these strategic choices speakers make to alleviate difficulty may be more common than we think. So with that, I'll say thank you to my collaborator, Ella Bohlman, as well as everyone in the Learning and Language Lab at UIUC. So thank you.
Now it's on. I had to switch. I love this talk. This was great. I had many thoughts, but I'll just constrain myself to one. A new proposal in the object memory literature is that objects and their features are not stored as bound. And I think there's some interesting reflections we can take from the intersection of the modification literature and the memory literature, where modification boosts object memory. And I think you've identified a use of adjectives that is truly unbound to the thing you're talking about. It's about your need to space time out. So I think that this use of adjectives that you've identified would further break away the feature of the object that's being named from the object compared to, say, a contrastive or an attributive use of adjectives where they would be more bound. So I think this finding makes some super cool predictions for memory for objects and how they're bound to their features.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, that's really interesting. And I of course would love to see more crossover with the language and memory literatures. I think we have a ton to learn from each other.
Thank you so much for the talk. It was a very elegant study. Jane Lee from Johns Hopkins. I was wondering, since, when people do produce the adjectives, they also have to plan the adjectives themselves. And I was wondering if, perhaps you would, you were saying about the initiation time analysis, whether or not, I was wondering putting those factors in, say if they did say blue and that frequency of blue is higher than that of red. I have no idea what it's actually like whether or not the initiation times would show more clarity in terms of the planning difficulty of jacket versus candle.
Yeah, so I think part of why we see these adjectives is that they are bright, they're on the screen, they pop out at you, right? It's almost like right, like when you're trying to find a word to say, you look at the ceiling, right, to kind of get all the interference away. So I think that there's sort of this, it is in your face, it's really accessible and easy to say. But maybe along the lines of what you're saying, you ought to see differences based on the planning of the adjective, right? So we might see more optional red than magenta, something like that. So when the color isn't so in your face acceptable or accessible, so easy to name, you might see lower rates of adjective use, or you might see something going on in the latencies. Perhaps that kind of prediction is what you would make, and I would agree with that.
Thank you.
Okay. Yep. John Truswell, University of Pennsylvania. Terrific talk, very interesting. I was actually curious about the learning implications for this because of course, the learner can't reverse engineer all the reasons why these adjectives show up. And so I was curious if you've thought about whether this could lead to expectations about increased adjective use for uncommon words that just to mimic what is being encountered statistically. And so one thought, though, about this is that you could demonstrate the causal connection between this accessibility and the adjective use by, for instance, having people name the objects before they start the trial in monochrome or something like that, so that they demonstrate that they're going to call it jacket to begin with, either as the speaker themselves, mind you, or some other interlocutor.
Yeah, that's, I think, and absolutely, like that would be another really good test of this. I think that if you made it easier, if you took away that name agreement constraint, if you ought to see a lower rate of adjective use.
Right, and
Yeah.
I think if you observe someone else doing it, you probably wouldn't reverse engineer that tendency, although you might see priming effects for using adjective use, but it's really interesting to try to disentangle learning of the statistical tendencies from explanations for the patterns that a learner might have.
Yeah, I'm right, and that's the age-old question of how much of this is learning of the distributions all the way down versus each speaker is creating the distributions on their own. And I will say that it was easier for me to separate those before I got my second life as a language development researcher.
Right.
Hi, I'm Yenting Lee from UC Irvine. Thank you very much. This is super clear. I love it. I have a question about the non-competitor trials. So in that case, adding an adjective just extra, like, make things extra clear, right? And doesn't introduce any kind of risk. But if there is something that has the same color in the thing, would we expect to see maybe fewer use of adjectives just to avoid the risk of distracting people to the wrong thing?
That's a really good question, right? If the bell were blue, would you see lower rates of adjective use? I'm not sure. You might. And why would be a question, or you might not. I think that would be a really interesting condition to run and see, and that might help you figure out where it's coming from, how much is this sort of, oh no, I need more planning time, how much of it is these visual properties that are really hard to inhibit. That would be an interesting condition to run.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was very interesting. And my question is actually very, very overlapping with what John said. And I was thinking of exactly that manipulation, that it would be good to get someone to pre-plan the words or in a repeated mention condition. Because if you get rid of so one of the things that I'm very interested in is the fact that a lot of the cues can stem from different sources, and potentially they're both there. So in fact, if you get rid of the planning difficulty, you might actually still see the correlation. People still might be using adjectives more in the difficult name conditions, which would point to a different explanation. And that doesn't mean that there isn't also the planning one, but it would be interesting to try to tease apart multiple motivations for that and multiple kinds of distributions that learners might be picking up on.
I think that's right. There's a lot to do there. And I was also sort of thinking as you're saying this, there's sort of the difficulty of alleviation that might come from the name agreement versus a kind of manipulation where you're looking at frequency and you might expect more adjectives for frequency. And I could imagine the pre-training alleviating production difficulty differently in these conditions. And
Yeah, it's a rich program.
Thank you.
Yeah, and also, I'm just going to make a quick comment because I hope you weren't throwing disfluent trials out.
I think we included them for the adjective use, but excluded them for the timing measures. Let's
talk about that.
I might. I'll be that person and say, I have to ask Ella what we did.
Hi there, Xander Lynch from Cornell. So what I was wondering about is, would you expect to see the same kind of like egocentric adjective use when you have multiply modified like phrases? So for like if it was like the big blue jacket or something like that, would you expect that, and would you expect it only with kind of these super hard, like maybe the dachshund level words where you're trying to really access something that's like far out there?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the difficulty will increase the rates of adjective use, but I don't think, even something really easy, it might not go away. I mean, there's a lot that's hard about speaking, and so even a pretty easy to say word can be hard in the right discourse context. And so I don't think this is something that speakers are only doing, in periods of high difficulty, but if I want to manipulate it in the lab, finding a task that's very difficult facilitates that.
Thank you.
Hi, Jackie Fallon, University of Colorado. I'm wondering about the role of color typicality in your stimuli. So candles and maybe even more so jackets often vary in color, whereas whisks and bells much less so. Yeah, just wondering about your stimuli.
Yeah, so we tried to have none of, like not like a green banana, and like we tried to stick to things that could have been any color, because I think you're totally right. Like a green banana or a purple banana, you might be more likely to say purple because that's a weird thing to see. That is notable in many other ways. So we tried to not have that be a confound. I'm not going to say every single item is perfect, but I think you're right that would lead to a different kind of adjective use, maybe a similar or different explanation to what we're proposing here. But yeah, we tried not to have that be what's going on. So most of our items could be of any color.
Right. Maybe a better way to phrase
Yeah.
this is it would be interesting to have only objects that are of one typical color,
Yeah.
where it's usually
Oh.
non-formative, like to say the brown volcano if there are no other objects
Yeah.
that can vary in color.
Yeah.
If you still see the increased adjective use there.
Yeah, I think that'd be interesting. I mean, I suspect you would still see it, but yeah, that would be pretty neat because we know that kind of color typicality affects adjective use. Yeah.
Hey, Vic Ferreira, UC San Diego. Your comments about the degree to which the color of the thing on the screen in your face is part of what might be a factor, and this made me begin to wonder, could you get some more traction on the interplay of the different mechanisms you're talking about by looking for effects like this in natural corpora or in language model production? Like you could take the codability measures that are collected otherwise and map that onto individual nouns that are in a corpus, and also look at unigram frequency or things like that to look for a same side effect. Could that help? Yeah,
I think so. And I think originally what got me thinking on this work was some of that corpus work coming from the information theoretic perspective and thinking, oh, these are really interesting findings. But I suspect that thinking about speakers is going to shed some light on what's going on. But yeah, I think that would be a really nice test of the hypothesis and, absolutely a direction to go.
Hi, Jack in from University of Maryland. Thank you for the great talk. I have a really quick question about your use of egocentricity in this case. I mean, we can imagine that in an ideal world, we wouldn't be use adjective in the no competitor case. But I'm wondering, maybe I missed this about the design. So was there an audience on the other side of the screen? Or I was wondering how we can make that egocentricity, how can we contextualize that egocentricity with this design? Yes.
Yeah, so there was no audience here. It was just, speakers were talking to a computer, and we're kind of told, hey, whatever's in the green box, describe that thing in the green box. And so it could be that you can push people around if there's an audience of some sort. Certainly that probably matters a little bit. But I suspect that these results here would be robust here because I think it really is something the speaker's doing for themselves. Now, that doesn't mean there aren't lots of other things with adjectives that speakers are doing for their audience, but I think this particular effect here ought to be robust whether or not there's an audience. Yeah, thank you.
Real short. Did you look at trade-offs with filled pauses or any other attempts to try to delay things? It does also remind me of Vic's work on insertion of complementizers like that in some constructions.
Yeah, I'm going to have to ask Ella about some of those details about what we did, because I think...
Because you might see differences across conditions about, without the additional color, there might be more filled pauses.
Yeah, the fact that this isn't coming to mind makes me think that we didn't actually talk much about this because it was a fairly low rate of filled pauses. We counted pauses, and I think filled pauses were uncommon enough. We sort of said,
That's
well...
surprising with kids.
Yeah. I think that, that people would pause. I mean, it's a weird lab task, and it's actually quite an easy task at the end of the day. Okay. But... I can look at my data right now and answer your question better.
Well, we'll wait and see right now.
Yeah.